There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from realizing you've become invisible to the only people you thought would always see you. That you've stopped mattering to those you always put first, without question, without hesitation, without reservations. I lived in this solitude for a long time. So long that I had begun to believe it was all that was left for me. That this was how the rest of my life would be: empty, silent, measured not by moments lived, but by hours spent waiting for calls that never came, for visits that never happened, for a son who had forgotten me as one forgets an unimportant appointment. My name is Helen. I am 76 years old, and this is the story of how I was left completely alone by the person I created, whom I loved more than I loved myself, whom I placed before every dream, every desire, every need I ever had. And how an unexpected knock on the door changed everything in a way I could never have imagined. In a way that showed me that sometimes salvation comes from where you least expect it. Sometimes salvation comes from strangers who care more than blood of your own blood. From people who owe you nothing but choose to see you when your own family chooses to ignore you. Before we begin, if you feel touched by these issues and want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll be notified whenever a new story about people who found connection where there seemed to be none is shared here. Don't miss the chance to hear more accounts from those who discovered that we are never as alone as we think. Everything started to change, or rather, to get drastically worse, about 2 years ago. But to truly understand how I reached that point of absolute loneliness, that dark place where I had stopped believing that anyone cared, I need to go back a little further in time. I need to tell you about how the erosion happened, about how you can lose everything so gradually that you don't realize it until you're at rock bottom without knowing how you got there. My husband, William, died 12 years ago. 12 years that sometimes feel like a lifetime and sometimes like yesterday. Heart attack, sudden like thunder in a clear sky. Without warning, no chance to say goodbye. Without those last words you always imagine you'll have time to say. He was doing well on a Sunday morning in September. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows. The smell of coffee filled the house. He was reading the newspaper, making that disapproving sound he always made when he read about politics. Drinking his coffee with 2 spoonfuls of sugar, as I always told him he shouldn't, but he did anyway. Planning to fix the gate that had been creaking for weeks and that he always said I'll do it next weekend. And a few hours later, he was no longer here. He wasn't reading the newspaper anymore. He wasn't making plans anymore. He wasn't anywhere I could reach him. En de première taillée. Alone in that house that suddenly seemed too big, too empty, too silent. Each room echoing with absence. Each object screaming that he was no longer there to use it. Each night stretching on endlessly because there was no one left to share the silence with. But I had my son, David, my only son, the child I had carried in my womb for 9 months, whom I had brought into the world with mixed pain and joy, whom I had loved even before seeing his face, whom I had raised with all my heart, all my energy, all my being. He was there in the first few days after William's death. He helped me with the funeral, with all those practical and cruel details that need to be sorted out when someone dies. Choosing the coffin, choosing the flowers, choosing the music. As if you could choose anything that made sense when the person you loved for 43 years is no longer breathing. He stayed with me for the first few weeks. He comforted me when I cried at 3 in the morning. He made me eat when I didn't feel like eating. He got me out of bed when all I wanted was to stay there forever, disappear under the covers, not have to face a world where William no longer existed. He told me he would always be there for me, that I wasn't alone, that he would never leave me, and I believed him, because he was my son, because blood is blood, because mothers and sons don't abandon each other, right? And for a while, maybe the first year, he was there. He called regularly. At least once more I visited me. He brought his wife, Melissa, a woman I always thought was a little cold but who seemed to make David happy. So I accepted it. I smiled. I pretended that the distant way she treated me didn't bother me. I brought my two grandchildren, Emma and Lucas. Emma was 10 when William died. Lucas was 7. Beautiful, intelligent children who grew up so fast that every time I saw them, they seemed different, taller, older, more distant from me. We had Sunday dinners. I cooked, as I always had, those dishes that David loved as a child, those recipes that I had made 1,000 times, that I knew by heart. That made the house smell like a real home, even if only for a few hours. We had birthday parties, Christmas together, with a decorated tree and presents, and that illusion that we were a united family, a family that cared, a family that would remain that way forever. We were a family. Or at least, I thought we were. I thought those Sunday dinners would continue, that those Christmases would continue, that I wouldn't be alone, that David had learned through all those years of raising me, that family matters, that mothers matter, that you don't abandon the person who raised you, who loved you unconditionally, who always put you first, but little by little, so gradually that I barely noticed when it started, so slowly that there wasn't a specific moment I could point to and say this is where it changed. Things began to deteriorate. The calls became less frequent. Once a week became once every 10 days. Then every 2 weeks. Then the visits became less frequent. Every Sunday became 2 Sundays a month. Then one. Then once every 6 weeks. Then only on birthdays and Christmas. Then not even that. The moment. Mas Tillaba m'excuses. Mom, this week has been impossible. Work is crazy. We'll see each other next weekend. But the next weekend never came. Oh, when it did the next. Another last-minute commitment. Something more important, more urgent, more deserving of his time than spending a few hours with his mother, who was growing old alone in an empty house, a house full of ghosts and memories and silence. The boys have soccer, they have swimming, they have I don't know how many activities. You know how it is. I didn't really know, because I rarely saw my grandchildren anymore. I was rarely included in their lives. I rarely knew what was going on with them, beyond vague summaries that David gave me when he called, if he called at all. Melissa isn't feeling well. We should leave it for another time. Melissa never seemed to be feeling good when it came to visiting me, but I never said so. I never questioned it. I never confronted her because I was afraid. Afraid of being seen as the difficult mother-in-law. Afraid of pushing David even further away. Afraid of losing what little I still had. And me. I accepted it. I always accepted it. Premier à l'ouest, it's okay. Darling, I understand. Don't worry about. I always put his needs, his commitments, his life before mine. I always pretended it didn't hurt. That I didn't feel neglected, abandoned, forgotten. I always pretended that I didn't go days without talking to anyone, without seeing anyone, without hearing any other human voice besides the voices on the television, which I left on just to create the illusion that I wasn't completely alone. I always pretended not to look at my phone dozens of times a day, hoping it would ring, that David's name would appear on the screen, that someone would remember I existed. I always pretended everything was fine, because that's what I knew how to do. Pretend, accept, not be a burden, not be difficult, not be the kind of mother who complains, who demands, who expects too much. 2 years ago, something changed more drastically. David got a promotion at work. A big, important promotion. One he had been seeking for years. Senior manager at a technology company. Significantly higher salary. More responsibilities. More prestige, more Geschäft. And he was thrilled when he called to tell me. His voice was more animated than I'd heard in months. Talking fast about new projects, a new team, new opportunities. Finally, being recognized for his hard work. Finally, getting where he'd always wanted to be. And I was happy for him. Genuinely, deeply happy. Because that's what mothers do, right? They're happy for their children's successes. They celebrate their achievements. They put maternal pride above any other consideration, even when those successes mean less time together. Laissez attention, laissez présence, fewer chances of not being alone. That's wonderful, David. I'm so proud of you. I said, and it was true. I was proud, but I was also afraid. Afraid of what this promotion would mean for the little time he still dedicated to me. Afraid of becoming even more irrelevant in his increasingly busy and important life. Thank you, Mom, but it will mean even more work, more travel, more meetings. It's going to be intense for a while, but for a while became permanent. For a while became the new normal. For a while became forever. It was right after that promotion that things really fell apart. That what was already bad became unbearable. That I went from being neglected to being completely abandoned. The calls, which were already rare, practically stopped. Once every 2 weeks became once a month. Then once every 6, then style premier joueted. Always waiting. The visits became so sporadic, so rare, that I could hardly call them visits. More like occasional, quick appearances, always with an invisible clock ticking down, always in a hurry to leave, always with the feeling that he was fulfilling an unpleasant but necessary obligation, not spending time with someone he really wanted to see, and I could feel it. I could feel it in the hurried way he came in the way he constantly checked his phone even while we were talking, in the way he made up excuses to leave early, in the way his eyes never really saw me, only looked through me at something more important, more interesting, more worthy of attention. I had become an item on a to-do list, not a person, not her mother. Just something to be checked off and crossed off. Visiting Mom? Done. I might not do this again for a few more months. And then, about 6 months ago, something happened that broke me in a way I didn't know was possible. Something that was the final confirmation that I had truly become invisible, irrelevant, forgettable. It was my birthday, 76 years old. Not a particularly special number, perhaps. Not one of those milestone ages that people throw big parties for, that they celebrate with fanfare. Not 80, not 90, just 76. Another year, another mark. That time was passing and I was getting older, more frail, closer to the end. But still, it's a birthday. A day that should mean something. A day a mother hopes her son will remember, that he'll call, that he'll show her that she still matters, that she still deserves to be remembered, that she still has value beyond having been useful 3 decades ago when he was a child. I woke up that April morning with a timid, pathetic hope that I'm ashamed to admit. A hope that maybe, just maybe, David would call. Maybe he would come to visit me. Maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't spend my birthday completely alone like I had spent the previous one, and the one before that, each one lonelier than the last, each one a further confirmation of how little I mattered. I prepared a special breakfast for myself that morning on my birthday, not because I had someone to share it with, not because I was expecting visitors, but because I was trying, desperately trying, to make that day mean something, even if it was just to me. Even if no one else cared, I was going to try to care. I set the kitchen table with the white linen tablecloth William had given me for our 20th wedding anniversary. A tablecloth I rarely used because it was too good for ordinary days. But what day would be special enough if not my own birthday? Even if I were the only person there, even if it was just me and my ghosts. I used the porcelain dishes that were kept in the high cupboard, wrapped in tissue paper, waiting for special occasions that never came. Plates with gilded rims that my mother had given me when I got married. Delicate teacups that I was afraid of breaking, so I never used them, storing them away. Always storing them away. For what? For whom? I made pancakes. Something I hadn't done in years, maybe since William was alive. Since there was someone to appreciate the effort, since cooking for one person seemed to have purpose. Because making pancakes for one person always seemed too sad, too wasteful, too obvious a reminder of how alone you are. But that morning I did. I mixed the batter carefully. I heated the pan. I poured perfect circles of golden batter. I flipped them at the right moment. I stacked them on a plate. I drizzled melting butter over them. Golden honey dripped down the sides, and I sat down, alone at the table I had arranged with such care, and I tried to eat. I tried to savor it. I tried to make that moment mean something. But each bite was hard to swallow because my throat was tight, because tears threatened to fall, because the phone on the table, silent, was louder than any sound. A glaring reminder that no one had called, that no one had remembered, that my birthday, the day I came into the world, didn't matter to anyone but me. I cleaned the kitchen afterward. I washed the china carefully. I put away the linen towel. I put everything back in its place, as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't just wasted an hour of my life trying to make my birthday seem special when it clearly wasn't. I spent the rest of the morning and the entire afternoon waiting, trying not to look at my phone every 5 minutes, failing miserably. Peeking itupe, checking that somehow met someone as anyone. Remembered I existed. Nothing. I cleaned the house, even though it was already clean. I wiped down surfaces that didn't need it. I organized closets that were already organized, just to keep myself busy. To have something to do besides sitting and waiting and feeling that growing pain in my chest that came with each passing hour without a word from him. At 2 in the afternoon, I picked up the phone. I almost called David. I almost lowered myself to having to remind my own son of my birthday. I almost became that pathetic mother who needs to beg for attention because no one offers it voluntarily. But I stopped. I put the phone back. Because if I had to remember, then it meant nothing. If I had to ask, then it was worthless. I wanted him to remember on his own, to matter enough to be remembered without being asked. At voorheen première middag ik small, stwanleer. Plain chocolate from a box because I didn't have the energy to make it from scratch. Because all my attempts to make that day special had been exhausted by the morning pancakes that I had barely managed to eat. Because that's what you do on birthdays, right? You bake a cake, even if there's no one to share it with. Even if you know you'll eat a small piece and the rest will sit there in the fridge. Hardening day after day, a sad reminder of another year gone by, another birthday spent alone, another confirmation of how little you matter. I let a première louquet d'attitude. Pathetic thoughts raced through my head. Maybe David would still call. Maybe he'd show up unexpectedly. Maybe he was just waiting for the right moment. Maybe he had planned something special and I was worrying for nothing. Desperate thoughts, foolish hopes. Self-deception that I knew was self-deception but still clung to because the alternative, accepting that he had simply forgotten, was too painful. At 6 o'clock in the afternoon, I put icing on the cake. Light pink, trying to make it look festive, trying to create joy where there was none. I put it on a pretty platter. I placed it in the center of the kitchen table. And at 7, as the sun began to set, when the house was bathed in that golden, melancholy light of the late afternoon, I lit a candle. A single white candle I found in a drawer. A candle that had probably been left over from some romantic dinner William and I had had years ago. In a life that seemed to belong to someone else, not 76 candles, because that would be ridiculous, because that would be too depressing, because it would be too obvious, too visual, an admission of how pathetic my situation had become. A 76-year-old woman, alone, celebrating her birthday with a single candle because there's no one there to light the others. I stood in the kitchen, looking at that cake with its single candle, its small flame flickering in the breeze that came in through the open window, and I sang. I sang happy birthday to myself, quietly, almost in a whisper, as if she were ashamed, as if someone could hear and judge. As if singing happy birthday to herself were the most pathetic, saddest, loneliest thing anyone could. Happy birthday to you on this special day. Many happy returns, many years of life. My voice broke on the last line. Tears began to fall, and I blew out the candle. Première Mada wish. A desperate, pathetic wish, one that I'm still ashamed to admit, even to myself. I wished my son would call, that he would remember, that I still mattered to him, that I hadn't become so invisible, so forgettable, so irrelevant, that my own birthday could go unnoticed. I cut a piece of cake, a small one. I put it on a plate. I sat at the table, and I tried to eat it, but I couldn't. The first bite got stuck in my throat. The sweet taste was nauseating when everything inside me was bitter, and I pushed the plate away, put my head in my hands, and cried. I cried like I hadn't cried in a long time. Not those silent tears I had learned to control, but deep sobs that came from somewhere deep in my soul. Sobs that shook my whole body. Sobs that were years of loneliness, of neglect, of being forgotten, finally overflowing. And the phone on the table remained silent, impassive, like a cruel witness to my pain. At 8 o'clock at night, I finally accepted it. Truly, completely accepted it. He had forgotten. My only son, the child I had carried in my womb, whom I had fed with my own milk, whom I had cared for through every fever, every nightmare, every fear, every pain, had completely forgotten my birthday. There was no excuse of being too busy and calling later. There was no belated call with an embarrassed apology. Just nothing. Absolute silence. As if I didn't exist. As if the day I was born meant nothing. As if I meant nothing. I sat on the living room sofa. The same sofa where William and I used to sit together watching television. Where he would put his arm around me. Where I felt safe, loved, seen. That sofa that was now too big for one person. That was now just another reminder of how much empty space there was in my life. I grabbed that piece of cake I hadn't been able to eat. I forced myself a few bites because my body needed food even though my heart was broken. En de première criée. I cried from deep, visceral loneliness. I cried from abandonment. I cried from not understanding how I had reached this point, how I had become so invisible, so irrelevant in my own son's life. At 9:15, when I had almost given up all hope, when I was considering just going to bed and ending that miserable day, the phone rang. My heart leaped. A pathetic part of me still held on to hope. It was David finally, Mustolat. But he was calling. Better late than never, right? I picked up the phone with trembling hands. I saw his name on the screen, and I answered, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to let on how much I had cried, how long I had waited, how much I had suffered in the last 12 hours. David, Mom, how are you? How was I? How was I after spending my entire birthday waiting for him? After making pancakes alone, after singing to myself, after crying alone, after feeling completely forgot, of course no, because I had learned through years of silent training not to express pain, not to show need, not to be difficult. I'm fine, dear. And you, how was your day? Hectic, non-stop meetings. Work is absolute madness. I barely had time for lunch. I can barely breathe. There was a pause that lasted only a few seconds but felt like an eternity. A pause in which I waited, pathetically waited, for him to remember. And then, as if he had just remembered, as if it were an afterthought, as if it were something that had escaped his mind but wasn't really important, he said, "Oh, Mom, it's your birthday today, isn't it?" Sorry, with everything that's been going on here, I almost for congratulations, happy birthday, God. To words that deeper than any knife could. I almost forgot. As if it were acceptable. As if your mother's birthday was something you could almost forget, and it would be okay. As if those two words somehow softened the fact that he had spent the entire day, 12 whole hours, without thinking about me, even once. "Thank you, David," I said, and my voice came out hollow, empty, dead. But he didn't notice. Or if you did notice, you pretended not to because it was easier, more convenient. We need to schedule a dinner soon. You, me, Melissa, and the kids. Like old times. It's been a long time since we've really seen each other. Like in the old days. As if there were old times. As if there were a tradition of family dinners that needed to be revived. As if it wasn't him who had destroyed it, who had stopped coming, who had stopped calling, who had left me alone. That would be great, I said, knowing it was a lie. Knowing that this dinner would never happen. Or, if it did, it would be cancelled at the last minute. Or postponed indefinitely. Orewick, inconfortable, with shaking anxious to leave, knowing it was just another empty promise. Another crumb he threw to me and expected me to accept with gratitude. We talked for a few more minutes. A superficial, mechanical, empty conversation. He told me about his work projects, about meetings, about deadlines, about things that meant nothing to me, but that I listened to because it was all I got from him. Those few minutes of divided attention. I didn't say anything about my day, about the pancakes, about the cake, about Abu singing head to myself, about crying alone, because what good would it do? Because he didn't want to listen, because I would be that needy, desperate, difficult mother that nobody wants to have. And then he said he needed to go, that he had work early in the morning, that he needed to sleep, that he would call me soon. I love you, Mom. Good night, Jude. I did night on day up. And I stood there, holding the phone, feeling something inside me break in a way I didn't know if I could fix. Something fundamental, something essential. The last hope that I still mattered, that I was still seen, that I still had value to him. Because I almost forgot wasn't just about the birthday. It was about me. It was about having become so irrelevant, so invisible, so forgettable that my own son could go the whole day without thinking about me, even once. That the day of my birth, the fact that I came into the world, my existence could be an afterthought, a secondary thought, something that was almost completely forgotten. In the months that followed that devastating birthday, something changed inside me. Not dramatically, not as a conscious decision, but a slow change, like a light gradually fading until you're in complete darkness and barely remember what it was like to have light, what it was like to feel warmth, what it was like to believe you mattered. I stopped waiting. I stopped living by measuring my day by the possibility of the phone ringing. I stopped picking up the phone 1,000 times checking if I had missed a call, a message, any sign that someone remembered I existed. I stopped mentally planning conversations I would never have. I stopped imagining visits that would never happen. I stopped dreaming that things would go back to the way they were. That David would wake up one day and realize how much he had neglected me, how much he had forgotten me, how lonely his mother was and how much she needed him. I just stopped. I stopped fighting. I stopped trying. I stopped living and started simply existing. Waking up because the body wakes up. Getting up because staying in bed all day would raise questions. Eating because the body needs food, not because there was pleasure in it, not because there was flavor, just automatic fuel to keep it functioning. I watched television because the silence was too unbearable, because hearing voices, even if they were fake voices of fictional characters, was better than the absolute silence that screamed my loneliness. Because the flickering light of the screen created the illusion of life, of movement, that something was happening even when nothing was. Sleeping because the day was over and there was nothing left to do. Sleeping because in sleep, at least for a few hours, I didn't feel. I didn't think. I didn't perceive the emptiness. I didn't feel the constant pain of loneliness. Days turned into weeks without distinction, weeks into months that all seemed the same. And I barely noticed the passage of time because one day was exactly like the next, empty, without purpose, no connexion, nothing to make me feel alive, to make me feel human, to remind me that I was more than just a body occupying space in an empty house. David called occasionally, maybe once every 3 or 4 weeks, maybe less. I'd stopped counting. Short calls, superficial, mechanical, checking if I was okay, always in a hurry, always with something more important waiting, always wanting to end the call as quickly as possible, obligation fulfilled. And I always said I was fine. I always pretended. I always kept my voice cheerful, light. Not wanting to be the kind of mother who complains, who is a burden, who makes her child feel guilty, who is difficult to deal with. But I wasn't okay. I was so far from being okay. I was drowning in loneliness. I was slowly disappearing, day after day. I was becoming a shadow, a ghost in my own life, existing but not living, breathing but not feeling. Continuing, but with no reason to continue. And the worst part, I had started to believe that I deserved this, that I had done something wrong. that I wasn't interesting enough, important enough, worthy enough of being remembered, of being visited, of mattering to someone. It was in that state, in that deep well of loneliness and self-abandonment, that Tuesday morning happened. The morning that would change everything. The morning a stranger would knock on my door and remind me that I still existed. It was an ordinary Tuesday in October. Or at least, it should have been ordinary. But there was something different in the air that morning, something I couldn't name, a strange tension, a feeling that something was about to change, although I had no logical reason to think so. I woke up earlier than usual, before the sun had fully risen, before the birds began their morning chorus. In that grey moment, between night and day when the world seemed suspended, paused, waiting, I couldn't fall back asleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, that ceiling I knew by heart, every crack, every shadow, every imperfection, thinking about nothing and everything at the same time, feeling that familiar weight on my chest that had become my constant companion, that dull pain of loneliness that never really went away, only sometimes hurt more, sometimes less, but always there, always present. I got up. I went to the kitchen. I made coffee. The same mechanical movements I did every day. Grab the filter. Measure the coffee grounds. Pour the water. Wait. Not because I really wanted coffee. Not because I cared. But because it's what you do in the morning. It was routine. It was structure. It was something to do when there's nothing else. I sat at the kitchen table with my cup. I looked out the window at the backyard. Autumn leaves beginning to fall. Shades of orange and red and gold. Beautiful in a way I could no longer appreciate. Beautiful in a way that only reminded me that everything dies, everything ends, everything eventually falls and rots. The coffee grew cold in the cup as I sat there, lost in thoughts that led nowhere. Circular thoughts. Thoughts about David, about how I had gotten to this point, about how much longer I would live like this, about whether it was worth continuing to live like this. It was almost 9 in the morning when I heard it, a knock on the door. Not loud. No insistiu nor tap-tap. I froze. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, because nobody knocked on my door. Nobody visited me. Nobody came to see me. The last time someone had rung that doorbell was, I couldn't even remember. Months ago, the mailman delivering a package I hadn't ordered, a salesperson I'd sent away. But the knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. Real, insisted now. I got up slowly. My heart was beating faster than it should. Irrational nervousness was taking over because I wasn't used to this. I wasn't used to unplanned, unexpected human interaction. I had become so isolated, so closed off in my little world of solitude that the mere thought of someone at my door made me anxious. I walked to the front door. I looked through the peephole, and I saw a boy. She couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old. Dark brown hair, a little messy, a youthful face with that innocence that children still have at that age. Before life begins to harden its edges, before disappointments begin to shape its expressions, he was holding something. A toolbox, old, worn, obviously used 1,000 times. And he was looking at my door with determination, with purpose, as if he had come here for a specific reason. I opened the door slowly, just a crack, still unsure, still not understanding what was happening. "Can I help you?" I asked, and my voice sounded strange, even to me, hoarse, as if it hadn't been used properly in a long time. Because it hadn't. Because days went by without me speaking to anyone but myself. And even those solitary conversations had become rare. The boy looked at me with light brown eyes, direct, without the discomfort that adults often show when looking at elderly people. As if aging were contagious, as if looking for too long would contaminate oneself with loneliness and mortality. Good morning, ma'am. My name is Marcus. I live in the blue house at the end of the street. I knew that house. I'd seen the family move in a few years ago, a young couple, to children, a dog. That kind of no active family always mean always with life, honey. The kind of house I sometimes looked at when I drove by with a mixture of nostalgia and envy, remembering when my house was like that too, when there was also laughter and movement and purpose. Nice to meet you, Marcus, I replied, still confused about what he was doing at my door. I started a small repair business in the neighborhood, he explained, with a charming seriousness, as if he were giving a formal business presentation and not a child knocking on random doors. I fix small things that people need. I change light bulbs, fix dripping faucets, tighten loose screws, that sort of thing, for a very affordable price. And I noticed that your fence out front has some loose pieces. I could fix it for you, if you want. I looked where he was pointing. And yes, he was right. Where the fence da butto fal. I'd noticed it months ago, but hadn't done anything about it, because, well, why bother? Who cared about my fence? Who would come to visit and notice? Who was looking? Nobody. I don't know, I began, insecure, unaccustomed to making decisions, unaccustomed to having to consider anything beyond my empty routine. It won't cost much, he hastened to say, and I do a good job. My father taught me. He says that if you're going to do something, you should do it right, not halfway. I can show you other houses where I've worked, if you want references. There was something in his seriousness, in the way he spoke like a little adult, trying so hard to be professional, that touched something inside me. Something I thought had died, a small glimmer of, I'm not sure exactly, tenderness, connection, the simple feeling of being seen, of someone noticing my house, my broken fence, of someone thinking of me enough to knock on my door. Okay, I heard myself saying, almost surprised by my own words, you can fix the fence. His face lit up, a genuine, wide smile, full of that unfiltered joy that only children can have, as if I had just made his day better, when in fact he had just made mine better simply by being there, by talking to me, by treating me as if I mattered enough to deserve his attention. Great, I'll start right now. It won't take long. And he went. He put his toolbox on the ground. He knelt by the fence. He began to work with intense concentration, his tongue slightly sticking out of his mouth the way children do when they are focused, totally absorbed in his task. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching, not wanting to interrupt, not wanting him to stop, because there was something comforting about seeing another person in my space, about hearing sounds of activity that weren't coming from the television, about seeing life happening in my small, dead world. After a few minutes, I went back inside. I went to the kitchen, and suddenly, for the first time in a long time, I felt like doing something beyond just existing, something beyond sitting and waiting for the day to end. I made lemonade. I squeezed fresh lemons that I had bought at the market the previous week, but had considered letting go to waste because who was I making lemonade for? For myself. What was the point? But now it made sense. There was someone there. Someone who was working in my yard, fixing my fence, treating my property as if he cared, and he deserved something cold to drink on a hot October day. I poured the lemonade into a pitcher. I grabbed 2 glasses. 2, because maybe, just maybe, I would join him. Maybe we would talk. Maybe, for a few minutes, I wouldn't feel so terribly alone. I left. Marcus was still working, sweat on his brow, dirty hands, but smiling, clearly pleased with his progress. I brought lemonade. I offered, feeling strangely shy, as if I no longer knew how to interact with people, as if I had forgotten the basic rules of human courtesy after so much time alone. He stopped. Elle looked up. And that smile again, that smile that seemed to light up, not only his face but everything around him. Thank you, ma'am. That's very kind of you. I poured lemonade into both glasses. I gave one to him. I held the other. And we stood there, in my front yard, drinking lemonade, in comfortable silence. Not the suffocating silence of loneliness, but the tranquil silence of shared presence. Your fence is almost ready, he said after a few sips. Just a few more minutes, and it'll be as good as new. You're very talented, I commented, and it was true. For someone so young, he clearly knew what he was doing. My father teaches me, he explained with obvious pride. He says it's important to know how to fix things, that you shouldn't always depend on others, that there's satisfaction in using your own hands, in making something work again when it was broken. His father. There was so much love, so much respect in the way he spoke about his father, and I felt a pang, envy, perhaps sadness, definitely, because David never spoke of me like that. David never mentioned me with pride, with affection, with that kind of admiration that Marcus clearly had for his father. Your father seems to be a wise man, she said softly. He is, Marcus agreed without hesitation. He always says we should take care of our neighbors, that community matters, that people shouldn't be alone if they can avoid it. That's why I started this business, actually. Not just for the money, although I'm saving up for a new bike, but because he said there are a lot of people in the neighborhood, especially older people, who need help with little things but don't know who to ask. Older people who need help, who don't know who to ask. It was me. He was describing me. And something broke inside me with those words. Not in a bad way, but like when ice begins to crack in spring. Like when something frozen finally, slowly, begins to melt. That's very thoughtful, I managed to say, though my voice was hoarse with emotion. He finished his lemonade. He put the glass back on the tray I had brought, and he went back to work. 20 minutes later, he was finished. The fence was fixed, firm, stable, as it should be, as it hadn't been for months, maybe even a year. There, he announced with satisfaction. Everything is fixed now. It will last a long time. How much do I owe you? I asked, searching for my wallet that he had brought with me. 15 reais, he sighed. That's my standard price for small repairs like this 15 reais. Such a small amount. An amount that didn't even cover the true value of what he had done. Not just fixing the fence, but seeing me, noticing me, treating me as if I mattered. I gave him 20. Keep the change. Are you sure, ma'am? He asked, surprised but clearly happy. Absolutely. You did an excellent job. He carefully tucked the money into his pocket. He picked up his toolbox, and then before leaving, looked at me really looked not hurriedly, not distracted, but with genuine attention. And he asked, are you all right, ma'am? You seem, I don't know, sad, perhaps. No what? No like that non-concern. Not looking me in the eye expecting a real answer, not just a polite one. For a moment, I considered lying, saying everything was fine, like I always did, keeping up appearances, not being a burden to a child who barely knew me. But there was something in his eyes, something gentle, something that made me feel he really wanted to know, that he really cared, that I could be honest, at least a little. I've been feeling a little lonely lately, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, as if he understood, as if it made perfect sense to him. My father always says that loneliness is the hardest thing, he said with that old seriousness too serious for his age. That people need people, that we weren't made to be alone. Do you have family nearby? I have a son, David, but he's very busy. Work, you know how it is. Even now, even to a stranger, I was making excuses for David, protecting him, not wanting to admit the whole truth, not wanting to say that he had abandoned me, that he had forgotten I existed, that he didn't care enough to visit, to call, to remember. Marcus seemed to think about it for a moment. Well, he said finally, if you need anything else fixed, I'm always available. And if you just want company, I can bring my mother to visit you. She loves meeting people, and she makes the best cookies you've ever tasted. She always says cookies are better when shared. Tears filled my eyes, suddenly, unexpectedly, because there was so much care in those words, so much genuine kindness. From a stranger, from a child. More kindness than I had received from my own son in months, maybe years. I would really like that, I managed to say, my voice breaking slightly. Then it's decided, he said, smiling. I'll talk to my mother. We'll come visit soon. Maybe this weekend. And then he left, walking down the street with his toolbox, whistling a tune I didn't recognize, leaving behind an old woman standing in the yard, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in a long time, not just from sadness, but from something different, something I had forgotten was possible to feel, hope. I went back inside the house, but something had changed. The silence didn't seem so suffocating. The loneliness didn't seem so absolute. Because someone had seen me. Someone had noticed. Someone had cared enough to ask if I was okay. To offer not just service, but company. To treat me as if I were more than just a house with a broken fence. As if I were a person who deserved attention, consideration, kindness. I spent the rest of that day in a different state, not exactly happy, not exactly excited, but awake, alive in a way I hadn't been in a long time, thinking about the promised visit, about shared cookies, about a sensation of connexion, of not being alone, Elise. That night, for the first time in months, I didn't just sit in front of the television waiting for the day to end. I looked around the house. I really looked, seeing how I had let things deteriorate, seeing how I had stopped caring, dust on surfaces, not dust from a day or two, but dust from weeks, months of neglect, framed photographs that I no longer looked at, turned face down on the wall or covered, curtains that remained closed because opening them meant acknowledging that outside there was a world that continued even when you had stopped. I had let the house die along with me. I had let everything reflect my inner state, dark, closed off, neglected, lifeless. But now, thinking about the possible visit, feeling that small spark of hope that Marcus had ignited, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a desire to try, a desire to change something, a desire to make my home, my space, reflect not on giving up, but on possibility, not death, but life, even if it were just a small, timid life, starting over after being suffocated for so long. The next day Wednesday, I woke up with a purpose, something I hadn't felt in months. Not just waking up because my body wakes up, but waking up with a reason, a small one, but a reason nonetheless. I opened the living room curtains. Sunlight flooded the space for the first time in I don't even know how long, and it hurt. It literally hurt my eyes, accustomed as they were to the stimulate, but a pain of life, a pain of change. I started cleaning, slowly, because my body at 76 didn't move like it used to, because I didn't have the energy I had decades ago. But with determination, with care, dusting, organizing, making that house feel like a home again, not a mausoleum. I turned the photographs back around, photographs of William and me, photographs of David as a child, family photographs that I had hidden away because looking at them hurt too much, because they were too obvious reminders of better times, of when I wasn't alone, of when I was loved. But now, looking at them, I didn't just feel pain. I felt memories. Gratitude for having had those moments, even though they were over. Recognition that I had lived, had loved, had been part of something, even if I was alone now. I organized the kitchen. I washed dishes that had been piled up for days. I cleaned the counter. I threw away food that had spoiled in the refrigerator because I didn't care enough to eat properly, to take care of myself, to see the value in keeping myself nourished. I changed the bed sheets, clean sheets that smelled of detergent, not neglect, sheets that made the bed feel inviting again, not just a place to collapse at the end of an empty day. And while I was doing all this, I felt something changing inside me too, not dramatically, not like in movies where people have sudden epiphanies and their lives instantly transform, but a subtle change, a softening of that hardness, that resignation that had settled in. Something vows Marcus hading vutsimpel, had seen me he had knees, and in doing so, he had reminded me that I still existed, that I was still worthy of attention, that I still mattered, at least to someone, even if it was a 10-year-old boy I barely knew. On Thursday afternoon, I was washing some dishes when I heard the doorbell ring. My heart raced. It was too early in the week for Marcus to be coming back, if he was even coming back at all. Maybe that promise to visit had just been politeness. Maybe he had forgotten. Maybe I had placed too much hope, too much weight on the casual words of a child who didn't understand how desperately I needed connection. But when I opened the door, there he was, Marcus, and beside him, a woman who must have been about 40 years old, light brown hair, a warm smile, kind eyes, and in her hands, a bowl covered with aluminum foil. "Hello, Mrs. Helen," Marcus said with that same radiant smile. "This is my mother, Sarah. I told her about you, and she insisted we come visit you. It's a pleasure to meet you, Helen," Sarah said, extending her free hand. Her hand was firm, warm, genuine. Marcus couldn't stop talking about you, about how nice it was to fix your fence, and about how you seemed a little lonely. "I hope you don't think we're intruders showing up like this." "No, absolutely not," I managed to say, emotion tightening my throat. "Please, come in. Come in." They came in, and suddenly, my house didn't seem so empty. Suddenly, there were voices, laughter, life. Sarah placed the bowl on the kitchen table. I brought chocolate chip cookies. Marcus wasn't kidding when he said they're the best. It's my grandmother's recipe. I made tea. I served the cookies on a plate, and the three of us sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat alone for so long, the same table where I had sung happy birthday to myself on my birthday. The same table that had been a silent witness to my loneliness. But now she wasn't alone. Now there were people. Strangers who, in just days, had become something more. Not friends yet, perhaps, but connections, possibilities. Reminders that people can care, even when they aren't obligated to, even when they have no reason beyond simple kindness. We talked about everything and nothing. Sarah told me about her job as a nurse. Marcus spoke excitedly about school, about his friends, about the bicycle he was saving up to buy. They asked about my life, and I told them not everything, not the full depth of my loneliness, my abandonment, but I told them about William, about the good years, about how empty the house felt after he was gone. I didn't mention David, or rather, I only mentioned him in passing. I have a son, but he's very busy. The same empty phrase, the same protective shield I used to avoid having to admit the whole truth. But Sarah seemed to see through it. There was something in her eyes, that understanding that comes from experience. From having seen so many lonely people in her work as a nurse, from knowing how to recognize pain even when it's hidden behind polite smiles. It must be difficult, she said gently, growing old alone after having had a family. And those simple words, that simple acknowledgement of my pain, made something break inside me, not dramatically. I'd of them. But première felt-il être truly seen. No juged, not pitied, just understood. They stayed for almost 2 hours. 2 hours that passed like minutes. 2 hours that were more human interaction, more real connection than I'd had in months, maybe even a whole year. As they stood up to leave, Sarah hugged me. Not a polite, distant hug, but a real, warm hug that lasted longer than necessary. A hug that said, I see you, I care, you're not alone. We'll be back next week, she promised. If you'd like, of course. We don't want to be intrusive. Please come back, I said, my voice thick with emotion that I didn't try to hide. I'd love to, that night, sitting alone once again, but somehow not feeling the loneliness so deeply. I picked up the phone. I looked at David's name in the contacts. I thought about calling. I thought about telling him about Marcus and Sarah, about how strangers had shown me more kindness than he had in months, about how I had felt seen, valued, important for the first time in so long. But I didn't care, because what good would it do? Because he wouldn't understand. Or worse, he would get offended, defensive, and talk about himself, about how busy he was, about how unfair I was being. But something had changed in that moment of considering calling, but deciding not to. A small change, a subtle shift in how I saw myself, in how I viewed my situation. I had spent so much time waiting for David to save me from my loneliness, waiting for him to notice, for him to change, for him to go back to being the caring son he used to be, or that I thought he was. But perhaps salvation wouldn't come from him. Perhaps it would never come from him. Perhaps I needed to stop waiting for crumbs from someone who clearly wasn't going to offer them, and start accepting the whole loaf of bread that was being offered by people who, though strangers, cared more genuinely on some days than my own son had cared in months. In the days that followed, something interesting began to happen. Marcus and Sarah not only returned as promised, but they started coming regularly, not every day, but once or twice a week. Sometimes just Marcus, doing some small repair he'd noticed. Sometimes Sarah, bringing extra food she'd made. Sometimes both of them, just to chat, to have tea, to keep me company. And each visit, each interaction, was like oxygen to someone who had been suffocating. It was like light to someone who had lived in darkness. It was life injected back into something that had begun to die. I began to look forward to these visits. Not in the desperate, dependent way I waited for calls from David, but with genuine joy, with anticipation that wasn't burdened with fear of disappointment. Because they always came when they said they would. Because they kept their promises. Because they treated me as if my company had value, not as if it were an obligation they needed to fulfill. And I realized something that should have been obvious, but it took me that long to truly understand. My son wasn't coming because he was busy. My son wasn't coming because he didn't want to come. Because I wasn't a priority. Because he had chosen, consciously or not, to exclude me from his life. And no amount of waiting, no amount of excuses I made up for him, no amount of self-sacrifice was going to change that. But Marcus and Sarah, they also had busy lives. Sarah worked long shifts at the hospital. Marcus had school, homework, friends, activities, but they found time because they wanted to, because they chose to, because they saw me as someone who deserved time, attention, care. And that realization, although painful, was also liberating in a way. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, about 3 weeks after that first knock on the door, that everything became crystal clear in a way it never had been before. Sarah had come to visit me, alone this time. Marcus was at school, but she had a day off and had decided to spend a few hours with me. We were sitting in the living room, drinking tea, talking about nothing in particular. And then, without any warning, she asked, "Helen, can I ask you something? Your son, David, when was the last time he came to see you?" The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I considered lying, maintaining appearances, protecting David. But there was something in Sarah's eyes, that kindness that made her feel safe being honest. It's been for months, I admitted, my voice coming out low. The last time he actually came here was in June. He stayed for less than an hour. Sarah didn't seem shocked, just sad. A gentle, compassionate sadness. And does he care? Sometimes. Once every 3 or 4 weeks. Short calls. Always in a hurry. And what about you to him? I used to. But I realized I was always interrupting something. So I stopped. I wait for him to call. And when he doesn't call, I just wait some more. The words poured out in a torrent, as if they had been held back for so long. My birthday was in April, 76 years old. Et forgot, or almost forgot. He called at 9 o'clock at night and said I almost forgot, as if that were acceptable. Tears began to fall. And the worst part, Sarah, is that I keep making excuses for him. I keep saying he's busy, that he has his own family, as if that justifies abandoning his mother. Sarah took my hand. She held it tightly, and she didn't say anything for a moment. She just held it. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but also firm. "Helen, can I tell you something? You don't need to keep waiting for someone who chose not to show up. You don't need to keep making excuses for someone who doesn't deserve your apologies. And you definitely don't need to keep living as if your life has no value just because one person decided you're not a priority." The words were harsh, but also liberating. "You've allowed his neglect to define your worth," Sarah continued. "You've been living in a kind of living death, waiting for something that may never come. But he's my son," I protested weakly. "Blood is blood. Family is who acts like family," Sarah said. "Family is who shows up, who cares." And forgive me for saying this, Helen, but based on what you've told me, David hasn't been acting like family for a long time. Those words should have made me angry, but they didn't, because they were true. Marcus and I have only known each other for 3 weeks, Sarah continued. We're practically strangers. We have no obligation to you, but we chose to come here. We chose to spend time with you because we like you, because we see value in you. She paused. And if strangers can see this, then the problem isn't you, Helen. The problem is that David chose not to see, and you can't control his choices. But you can control your own. What do you mean? I mean, you can keep waiting for crumbs. Or you can choose something different, like accepting the love that is being offered instead of clinging to the love that is being denied, like building connections with people who truly want to be in your life. We sat in silence for a long time, and something began to change inside me. An acceptance of something I had resisted for so long. David wasn't going to change. He had shown me who he was, what his priorities were, and no amount of waiting was going to change that. But maybe Sarah was right. Maybe I had a choice about how I responded. How do I do that? I finally asked, how do I stop waiting for him? First, Sarah said gently, you stop measuring your worth by his behavior. You stop believing that because he doesn't show up, you're not worthwhile. She squeezed my hand tighter. Secondly, you start investing in the connections that are working. Marcus and I chose you, and we're not the only ones in the world who would choose you. There's a whole world out there, Helen, and you've been closing yourself off to all of that because you were waiting for someone who isn't coming. But I'm old. Who's going to want a relationship with me? You're offering something right now. You're offering your presence, your conversation, your story. And that Marcus valut à te Davy. Just give up on him. Sarah thought for a moment. You don't give up on him, but you stop making him the center of your universe. You live your life. You build connections. And if he decides to show up, you deal with it when it happens. But you put it mad sense, pickle sense. But it made sense nonetheless. In the following days, I processed that conversation and I realized something. Ever since David had started to distance himself, I had entered a kind of perpetual waiting period. My life had become defined by his absence. I would wake up and check my phone, hoping to hear from him. And when there was nothing, the day would already begin with disappointment. I let food spoil because cooking for one person seemed pointless. I let the house fall into disrepair because who was there to clean it for? Nothing seemed to have a purpose without him. But Marcus and Sarah had shown me something different, that I could matter, not because of blood ties, but simply because I was a person with intrinsic value. On Friday of that week, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I left the house, not to buy groceries, but for a different purpose. I drove to a small cafe downtown, a place William and I used to frequent, a place I hadn't visited since he died. I ordered a cappuccino. I sat at a small table near the window, and I stayed there, just sitting, watching people, listening to conversations, feeling like I was part of something, remembering that the world continued, that people continued living, connecting, and that I could be a part of it. When I got home, the loneliness didn't seem so absolute, because I had done something. I had chosen something. I had taken a step towards living instead of just existing. Sarah was right. I had a choice, not about David, but about myself, about how I lived. On Saturday afternoon, Marcus and Sarah came again. Auntie Team, they brought us Fatima, their youngest daughter. They brought food. We had lunch at my dining table. That table that had been empty for so long, and I looked around at these people who barely knew me, but who had chosen to be there, who treated me not as an obligation, but as if my presence had value, and that femme genuine gratitude. After lunch, Sarah and I sat on the porch. Thank you, I told her, for everything, for caring, for that difficult conversation. You don't need to thank me. We're here because we want to be. Did I bring something for you guys too? Of course. Marcus talks about you constantly, about how you hear his stories. And that's rare. Helen, you really see him. I hadn't thought about it that way. And can I tell you a secret? Sarah continued. It's made us think about our own lives, about not taking our relationships for granted. So, you're teaching us that too. Tears filled my eyes. But they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude for what I was gaining. There's something I want to ask you, Sarah said. The community center near here has a senior citizens group that meets twice a week, and I thought, maybe you'd like to go. Meet other people. Get out of the house regularly. My first instinct was to say no, but then I remembered the conversation about choices, about accepting love that is being offered. I'd like to try, I heard myself saying. Our next meeting is on Tuesday at 10 in the morning. I can pick you up if you want. And so my life began to change in small steps, small choices. The following Tuesday, I went to the community center. The group was small, about 12 people, faces marked by time, but also warm and welcoming. I met Margaret, an 82-year-old woman who understood, in a visceral way, the loneliness I had experienced. I met Robert, whose children had moved away and visited rarely. I met other people with similar stories. And I realized that I wasn't alone in my loneliness. And there was something comforting about that. I started going regularly, Tuesdays and Thursdays, not because I had to go, but because I wanted to. Because I had something to look forward to. That wasn't a connection that probably wouldn't come. Marcus still came regularly. Sarah and I had developed a real friendship. And David, he called once during that period. A short call, superficial. And me? I didn't fall apart. I did this premier, je let go. For it was, and I didn't let it define my worth. Because I had other things now, other contacts. A life that was beginning to take shape again, small still, but real. It was on a Thursday in November, almost 2 months after that first knock on the door, that David showed up unannounced. I was getting ready to leave. I had arranged to meet Margaret for lunch, something we had started doing occasionally, in addition to our meetings at the community center. I was putting on my coat when I heard the sound of a car pulling up in front of the house. I looked out the window and saw his car, that silver sedan I knew so well. My first instinct was panic, not joy, not relief, but panic, because something must be wrong. He never showed up without warning. I opened the door before he knocked, and there he was. Misson, 45 years old now, hair starting to turn grey at the temples, looking older, more tired than I remembered. David, is everything all right? Did something happen? He seemed surprised by my reaction. Everything's fine. Mom, I thought I'd stop by to see how you're doing. I was in the area for a meeting and decided to drop by. He decided to drop by, as if I were a convenient stop. And I felt something strange at that moment. Not the desperate joy I usually felt during his rare visits, but something closer too, unease, because he was interrupting my plans. "Come in," he said. "But I need to tell you that I have an appointment in half an hour. I'm having lunch with a friend." He seemed surprised, maybe even offended. "Oh, you have friends now." There was something about his tone, as if the idea were improbable, and something within me, something that had been dormant for a long time, awoke. Not anger, but clarity. Cold, calm clarity. Yes, David, I have friends. People who care about me, who spend time with me, who genuinely want to be in my company. He caught the tone, the implication. What does that mean? It means we went ainsi, off your full of wed makeup. And the silence between us was full of unspoken things, of years of neglect that were never addressed. We served coffee. We sat at the table, and I looked at my son. "David," I began, my voice calm and firm, "when was the last time you visited me before today?" He seemed uncomfortable. I don't know exactly. A few months maybe. For months. June, you stayed for less than an hour. I'm busy, Mom. Work is intense. The children have activities. Melissa, stop. I interrupted. Just stop. Don't give me excuses that we both know are just that. Excuses. These aren't excuses. These are real reasons. You have neighbors on this street, he said. A 10-year-old boy, Marcus. He comes by 2 or 3 times a week. Schul homework, friends or activities, but he feels not because he has to, but because he wants to. David said nothing. Your mother, Sarah, a nurse, works long shifts at the hospital, has 2 children, a house to take care of, busy life, but she comes to visit me regularly. These people, who barely know me, who have no obligation to me, have treated me with more care, more respect, more genuine love in the last 2 months than you have treated me in the last 2 years. I saw something pass across his face. Guilt, perhaps, or anger, or defensiveness. So I'm not good enough? I don't need your money, David. What I needed, what I've always needed, was you. Your presence, your attention. To feel that I still matter to you. You will always matter. You are my mother. But you don't act like I matter, I said, and my voice broke slightly. You forgot my birthday, David, my 76th birthday. You called at 9 o'clock at night saying I almost forgot. He looked down. Dune. Première madake qui les candle. 1 candle, David, and I sang happy birthday to myself, alone in my kitchen, crying, waiting for you to call. I saw tears in his eyes. And when you finally called, I pretended everything was fine. I pretended I hadn't spent the whole day in utter loneliness because I didn't want to be that needy mother. So I swallowed my pain and gratefully accepted your crumbs. Mom, I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't ask. Because your connections are mechanical. There's no real room for honesty. A heavy silence filled the kitchen. Why are you telling me this now? Scared. Because I was afraid. I admitted. Afraid that, if I complained, you would distance yourself even further. But in the last few months, I've learned something important. What? I learned that accepting crumbs doesn't make anyone give you the whole loaf of bread. I learned that I can have dignity, that I can have standards. I have friends now. I have connections. I have things to do, places to go, people who truly want my company. And I'm not going to treat them as inferior substitutes anymore while I wait for you. So these people are more important to you than I am. They are no more important, but they are no less important either. Relationships require presence, They require effort. They require genuinely caring. He remained quiet. I'm tired, David, tired of being invisible to you, tired of feeling like an obligation. But do you realize I was already alone? Your occasional physical presence didn't change the fact that I was emotionally and spiritually alone. So what do you want from me? I just want you to be honest. If you don't want to be a meaningful part of my life, then don't pretend you do. Just be honest about where I fit into your life. I looked at the clock. I need to get ready to leave. You can stay if you want. But I need to go. He seemed genuinely shocked. You're really going to leave me here and go away? I have an appointment, David. Someone is waiting for me. And I'm not going to skip it just because you decided to show up unannounced. I'm not putting everything on hold for you anymore when you don't do the same for me. I saw shock on her face, hurt, anger, but also, perhaps, the beginning of understanding. You've changed, he said. Yes, I changed. Because I needed to. Because continuing the way I was meant, dying slowly of loneliness. I grabbed my bag. My coat. You're always welcome here, David. Always. But don't expect me to just wait for you anymore. If you decide to be a real part of my life, to be truly let's talk. Be honest, and let me live my life. And I left. I left my own house while my son was still inside. Something that Helen, 3 months ago, would never have done. I drove to the restaurant where Margaret was waiting. When I arrived, I felt not regret, but relief. Sorry, I'm late, I said as I sat down. Is everything all right? You seem shaken. And I told her about David showing up, about the conversation we had, and Margaret listened attentively, knowing there was never a rush. You did the right thing, she said. Difficult, but right, and I'm proud of you. When I got home, David's car was gone. There was a note on the kitchen table. Mom, you're right. About everything. I don't have any good excuses. I need to think about what kind of son I've been. I don't know if I can change. But you deserve honesty, and you deserve more than I've given you. I'll call soon, but only when I have something real to say I love you. David, I read the note, and I was okay with it because he had heard it. Really heard it. The days that followed brought a strange peace. I expected to feel guilty, but I felt peace. Because I had spoken my truth, because I had set boundaries. David called 3 weeks later. It was Thursday night. Hi, Mom. Hello, David. An uncomfortable pause. I've thought a lot about our conversation, he said. And you were right. About everything. I've been a terrible son. I've neglected you. Okay? He said simply. I want to try to do better. I want to be more present. Can we have dinner together? Next week, just the two of us. Just talk. Really talk. I would love to, he said. And it was true. Dinner was different. Strangely good. We really talked about his life, but also about mine. And I saw genuine interest in his eyes, as if he were truly seeing me, not just mother, but as a person. It didn't solve everything, but it was a start. A real, honest start. In the following months, things slowly improved. David started coming more regularly, every 2 weeks, sometimes longer. And when he came, he stayed longer. We really talked. My friendship with Marcus and Sarah deepened. They were like family to me. The group at the community center became a pillar in my life. Margaret became a close friend. And me, I was living, truly living, A life that had value, that had meaning, that had real connections, real purpose, real joy. One evening, a few months later, she was sitting on the porch. It was early spring. Marcus and Sarah had just left after dinner. David had called earlier because he'd been thinking of me. Margaret and I had plans for lunch tomorrow. And sitting there, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. There were still moments when I missed William. There were still moments when I thought about the years lost with David. But there was also this life I had built, these connections I had made, and I realized something profound. Salvation hadn't come from where I expected. It hadn't come from David changing. It had come from strangers who chose to care. From a boy who knocked on my door. From a kind nurse who saw loneliness in my eyes. But more importantly, salvation had come from within. From the choice I made to stop waiting and start living. From the decision to value myself. From the courage to speak difficult truths. From the willingness to accept the love that was being offered. I learned that when you start valuing yourself, when you stop accepting less than you deserve, something interesting happens. Either people choose to rise up to meet you, or they don't, and you discover you were fine either way. David had chosen to try, and I was grateful. But even if he hadn't chosen, I would have been okay, because I had learned that my worth didn't depend on him recognizing it. That night, before going to sleep, I gave thanks for the loneliness that had forced me to change. For David forgetting my birthday because it had been the push I needed. For the pain because it had shown me that I needed something different. And I thanked the people who had shown up, who had seen me when I felt invisible, who had reminded me that I mattered, because he had learned a more important lesson. You can't control whether others choose to see you. But you can control whether you see yourself, whether you show up for yourself, whether you act as if your own worth matters. And when you do that, you stop being invisible, not because others change, but because you change how you see yourself. And that inner change attracts people who see you too. This was my journey, from invisibility to visibility. From loneliness to connection, from almost giving up to living life to the fullest. And it all started with a knock on the door, with a boy offering to fix a fence, with a stranger who cared when blood didn't matter. Sometimes salvation comes from where you least expect it, from simple kindness that changes everything. From choosing to value yourself, even when it seems like no one else does. And one says, realik nooit, not from you. Because you have yourself. And finally, after all these years, that's enough. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. That way, you'll be notified whenever a new story like this is shared here. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment. You can share if you've ever experienced something similar, what this story evoked in you, or where you're watching it from. Sometimes, writing a few words is the first step in realizing you're not alone. Thank you for staying until the end, for listening to Helen's story. And remember, you matter. You deserve to be seen. And it's never too late to start valuing yourself. Until the next story.